everyone. Now, Parajumbles are a sore point with a lot of students, so I thought it would be a good idea for us to take a look at Parajumbles over the years. Now, the point of this video is to show you that Parajumbles can be easy, very easy, difficult and very difficult. Nevertheless, you never know what you're getting into until you actually start solving it, so I would always encourage you to try the Parajumble. Now, the years that we're going to be focusing on in this video are going to be somewhere between 2003 to 2007. Not too many questions, but a great variety. Another thing that we have done, just to make the exercise a little more interesting, is that we have removed the options. Because in the past, Parajumbles did appear with options, which made the task far easier and far less interesting. So we've removed the options, and the questions have been carefully selected so that they can be solved even without options. And that is what I would encourage you to do as well. Now let's take a look at our first question. This is from CAT 2003, and if you're wondering about what the R stands for, the R stands for retest. So CAT 2003 was an unfortunate year in which some enterprising individuals managed to actually leak the CAT paper. And therefore the exam was cancelled and another test had to be set up. So for CAT 2003, you will actually find two papers. We've taken the retest. Let's take a look at this question. We will be using our usual sort-link sequence strategy to solve this. The first sentence says, luckily the tide of battle moved elsewhere after the American victory at Midway. Now, when it says, luckily the tide of battle moved elsewhere, we don't know what battle is being talked about. So I know for sure at a very quick glance that this is definitely a follower. And that's all we need to do at the first stage. The second one, again, is definitely a follower. It could have been no more than a delaying tactic. What was a delaying tactic? So, follower. The third sentence here says, the Australian military, knowing the position was hopeless, planned to fall back to the southeast to defend the main cities. Now, what position was hopeless? Obviously, this is a response to a very serious situation. So, we know that this is also a follower. The fourth statement says, they had captured most of the Solomon Islands and much of New Guinea and seemed poised for an invasion. Who is they? Also a follower. So clearly we know that E is our starter. Not many people outside Australia realize how close the Japanese got. So probably I'm thinking that the Japanese were probably trying to or planning to invade Australia. Now if you look at D actually explains how close the Japanese had gotten. They had already captured some of the territory and they seemed poised for an invasion. So since D is an explanation for E and we know that D is definitely a follower, therefore we have formed our first link, which is ED. Now at the first glance, or if we read the sentences very, very quickly, this is something that we would definitely be able to manage, or hopefully be able to manage. You can take another look at all the statements to figure out the entire sequence. So let's do that now. We already know that E and D are supposed to be connected and E is our starter. So we've got a big part of the job done. Now if you look at C, it describes the Australian military's response to the threat of the Japanese invasion because they were poised for an invasion and the Australian military knew that the position was hopeless. So now I can put EDC in a sequence. Let's take a look at what B is talking about. It could have been no more than a delaying tactic. Now, the moment you say that the position was hopeless, what are the Australians trying to do? They're just trying to delay the Japanese. So, when they plan to fall back to the southeast, this could have been no more than a delaying tactic. So, ultimately, if the Japanese had invaded Australia, they would have probably captured the country. So B is going to be placed after C. Now all we need to do is to figure out what to do with A. Now A is the conclusion of the story. It's the final event that tells us why the Japanese did not actually invade Australia and capture it. Luckily, the tide of battle moved elsewhere. So now we have our entire sequence, which of course is EDCBA. This is a pretty easy Parajumble. And if you look at the sequence of events and you're even half logical about it, you should be able to get this one even without any options. This question is from CAT 2004. I personally thought it was a little confusing, although not on the very difficult side. So let's use our sort-link sequence. We will always try to use this to classify each statement as a starter or a follower. In the process, if you can find links, great. If you can't, that's okay. We start reading from the first statement one more time. The two neighbors never fought each other. Who are these two neighbors? We don't know, so this is a follower. B says, fights involving 3 male fiddler crabs have been recorded, but the status of the participants was unknown. So this is not quite a follower, at least there's nothing that indicates that this is a follower. And if you're not sure that something is a follower, it automatically means it could be a starter. So this may be the starter. We're not sure because this is our only our second statement. They pushed or grappled only with the intruder. They will have to have a reference to someone. So this is definitely our follower. Now D says, we recorded 17 cases in which a resident that was fighting an intruder was joined by an immediate neighbor and ally. So some of us might be in a hurry and we might say, okay, so probably D should be placed somewhere before A because we have already talked about neighbors in D and A talks about the two neighbors, maybe. And we could also say that D probably will be placed somewhere after B because we've already said that the status of the participants was unknown, right? So D provides some data about the status of the participants, but we don't have to be in a hurry. All we need to really note at this juncture is that D is a follower and be happy with that. So that's all we do. Now look at E. We therefore tracked 268 intruder males until we saw them fighting a resident male. We therefore tracked. Why did we do this? Because the status of the participants was unknown. So we have our first link, which is BE. Because we did not have too much information, therefore we studied these 268 intruder males. Now at this juncture, again, we will start reading from our first sentence and try to find the remaining links. So what we have so far is a link between B and E. After we have joined B and E, we can also go to D because tracking these 268 intruder males will probably lead to some data or observations which have been presented to us in D. So now we have linked B, E and D together. After we have recorded these 17 cases in which a resident that was fighting an intruder was joined by an immediate neighbor and ally. Now, since this crab is an ally, therefore it is very easy for us to go to A. The two neighbors never fought each other because they were allies. So this is nothing but the unfolding of a story about crabs. And then finally, all we need to do is to figure out our answer, which is BEDAC. Now C automatically will come at the end because we figured out the position of all the other statements. But it makes sense as well. The two neighbors never fought each other. They pushed. They refers to the two neighbors. So as you can see, even without options, this is not a very difficult parajumble. You just need to make sure that you are tracking the story properly and that you're not in a hurry to form your links. Now we have this question from CAT 2004. This question is not very complicated, but it does seem like that because we are unfamiliar with some of the terms. It's about American politics and we may or may not be familiar with that. So we will use our sort link sequence strategy to solve this one as well. He felt justified in bypassing Congress altogether on a variety of moves. Now we don't know who this he is, so we'll say this is a follower. B says at times he was fighting the entire Congress. Now let's not try to link A and B because there's really no reason for us to be in such a hurry. But we should know that he over here is also not identified yet. So B is also a follower. Let's look at C. We finally have a name. Bush felt he had a mission to restore power to the presidency. So is C our starter? Not really, because I would still question why did he feel that he had a mission to restore power to the presidency? Which presidency are we talking about? So this lacks a lot of background information which we normally should have in our starter sentence. So even though we have named Bush, still most likely a follower. Now when you come to D, Bush was not fighting just the Democrats. What should strike you immediately is that when you say not just something, something has to follow it. So D should be immediately followed by B. He was not fighting just the Democrats. At times, he was fighting the entire Congress. So the structure of both of these sentences should allow you to link them. Therefore, we have our first link, D and B. Now let's look at E. This could possibly be our starter sentence because it seems to be a pretty generic sentence in the first place. Representative democracy is a messy business and a CEO of the White House does not like a legislature of second guessers and time wasters. Now this sentence is slightly difficult to understand. Who is the CEO of the White House? Well, it will be the president. So probably now we are going to talk about President Bush. When we say does not like a legislature of second guessers and time wasters, basically he did not really want anyone questioning him. So I should be able to connect E and C. Since President Bush, who is the CEO of the White House, did not really want opposition or questioning, therefore he felt he had a mission to restore power to the presidency. Now this link is not very easy to make. It is partly based on your understanding of American politics, but if you are able to do that, then I think it's possible to move on with the rest of the sequence. Otherwise, yes, this is a point where you might get stuck. So now what do we have? We have EC and we have DB. Let's try to plug in the gaps. After putting these two together, we need to understand that since Bush felt that he was fighting the entire Congress, he might be a little annoyed with the whole situation and therefore feel justified in bypassing Congress altogether. So our link becomes B and A. Now the moment we are able to see this, we have our entire sequence. Our answer is ECDBA. Let's take a look at another question from CAT 2004. It's not because CAT 2004 is my favorite year. It's just that it offers quite a few interesting parajumbles. The year after CAT 2004, 2005 and 2006, these years were a little challenging on the VARC front. So you might want to take a look at those question papers. The parajumbles were not really the problem. They introduced a completely different question type, which was a problem. So that is why you will not find too many questions from 2005-2006 here. But let's take a look at another one from 2004. Now A clearly is going to be a follower, but this does not mean that death was the Egyptians' only preoccupation. So we say it's a follower and move on. Even papyri come mainly from pyramid temples. Now this also is a follower because of the word even. When you say even papyri, papyri is actually a source of information about the past because the Egyptians used to write things on papyri. So we do need to understand what papyri are, but the word even is a big clue here. So let's say this is a follower. Now let's look at C. When you read C, it says that a lot of our sources of information about the old kingdom are monuments of the rich like pyramids and tombs. This looks like it could be a starter. Because when we say even papyri come mainly from pyramid temples, it could possibly follow C. So already we say that this may be the starter, although we're not very sure. D says houses in which ordinary Egyptians lived have not been preserved, and when most people died, they were buried in simple graves. This talks about ordinary Egyptians, whereas in C we have talked about the monuments of the rich. Even papyri come mainly from pyramid temples, so ordinary people does not really seem to be the theme of this paragraph. So we would say that this is a follower. Now let's look at E. We know infinitely more about the wealthy people of Egypt than we do about the ordinary people, as most monuments were made for the rich. So this also looks like the starter, but the other more important point is that you need to understand that D is an extension of E. It adds to it. Most monuments were made for the rich, so what happened to the ordinary people? Those houses have not been preserved and they were buried in simple graves, which is why we don't really see monuments for ordinary people. So ED becomes our first link. E could possibly be the starter, but we're not very sure. All we know is that E and D are connected. Now, we haven't really found too much to connect in this so far, but let's take another look at all the statements. We know that ED are connected. After that, when we say even papyri come from pyramid temples, this probably should be connected to C. Why? Because we already talked about it, right? We've already said that traditional sources of information are primarily the monuments of the rich, and even papyri come from the pyramids. So it's extending that idea that most of our information comes from the monuments of the rich. So we have our second link, which is CB. Now, A seems to not really be connected to the overall theme because it talks about death being the Egyptians' only preoccupation. The rest of them are talking about how we know about the Old Kingdom or how we know about Old Egypt. So A probably should be placed at the end. So automatically now we have two possible sequences. We have EDCBA and we have CBEDA. I would say E is a better starter simply because it's a more generic sentence. Why am I saying that? C talks about specific sources of information, whereas E simply talks about how we know more about the wealthy people. So the way that I see it, E introduces the topic that we have more of one kind of information as against another, and the rest of the statements explain why. And so our answer should be EDCBE. Now we have another question from CAT 2004, but a somewhat easier one. Now the first sentence here has a clue that clearly tells us that this is a follower. Experts such as Larry Burns, head of research at GM, reckon that only such a full-hearted leap will allow the world to cope up with the mass motorization that will one day come to China or India. So when we say such a full-hearted leap, we are clearly referring to some sort of a transformation, perhaps new technology, because we are talking about mass motorization. So ultimately, we can classify this as a follower. Now B is also a follower because it starts off with but, so it's a contrasting point. But once hydrogen is being produced from biomass or extracted from underground coal or made from water, the way will be open for a huge reduction in carbon emissions from the whole system. B does in fact talk about a transformation. What is the transformation? Hydrogen being produced from biomass or extracted from underground coal or made from water. And what will this do? Huge reduction in carbon emissions. So the full-hearted leap that A mentions might actually refer to this new technology or new methods of hydrogen production in B. So we should be able to form our first link, which is B and A. Of course, when you're solving the question, you may not be absolutely certain, but as you read all the statements, you will become more and more certain that B and A are supposed to go together. Now let's look at C very carefully, and here there is a learning point. When we say in theory, this is something that is supposed to happen, all right? Now, a lot of times when we start off something with in theory, it is supposed to be followed by actual data. In theory tells us how something is supposed to be. After that, we talk about how things really are. Now, sometimes how things really are may not really be in accordance with the theory, and sometimes they might in fact support the theory. So the point I'm trying to make is that C in fact can be our starter. In theory, once all the bugs have been sorted out, fuel cells should deliver better total fuel economy than any existing engines. Now, the reason we are calling this a possible starter is that it is introducing the topic, which is fuel cells and how it compares with other types of existing engines. So, this may be the starter, but we can't be sure yet. D is clearly a follower. That is twice as good as the internal combustion engine. So, what does that refer to? Clearly, we will have to offer some data to say that that is twice as good as the internal combustion engine. So this is a follower. By the time we come to E, this parajumble should start making sense to you. Allowing for the resources needed to extract hydrogen from hydrocarbon, oil, coal or gas, the fuel cell has an efficiency of 30%. Now what we should note is that when in D we say that is twice as good, we are clearly referring to the efficiency of 30% mentioned in E. So we have our first link, which is the ED link. Now, as you can see, even though we were not sure whether C is a starter, now we can be pretty sure that C is the starter. We also know that E and D have formed a link. So what we have so far is C is a possible starter, E and D are a link, and B and A are a link, right? Now, all we need to do is to put this together. So for example, as I said, when we say in theory, after that, we would expect to present data to either oppose or support that theory. E and D present that data. So that means I can connect C, E and D together. So how does it make sense? Once all the bugs have been sorted out, fuel cells should deliver better total fuel economy. Now, E talks about the fuel economy that it currently delivers. D says that's not very good. And then after that, if you look at B, but once hydrogen is being produced from biomass or extracted from underground, the way will be open for a huge reduction. This is what is likely to happen in the future. So ultimately, our answer is supposed to be CEDBA. As I said, not a very complicated parajumble. Let's take a look at this essay type parajumble from CAT 2007. And if you look at the CAT 2007 paper, you'll find that there are quite a few essay type parajumbles there. So if you thought parajumbles are wordy now, probably take a look at these. The only helpful thing that they have done for us is that they have clearly told us that the sentence labeled A is the starting point. So we don't need to search for the starter. So whenever you have instructions like this, the first thing that I would try to do is to figure out what should follow A? Trust me, this is the easiest way to solve this question. But we also need to understand what A is talking about. So let's look at A. Personal experience of mothering and motherhood are largely framed in relation to two discernible or official discourses. The last sentence says, both of these tend to focus on the optimistic stories of birth and mothering and underpin stereotypes of the good mother. So even if you don't quite understand everything, we should understand that the topic is the discourse surrounding mothering and motherhood, and we are talking about two of them. These are the two official discourses. So this is our starter, it is given to us. Let's look at B. At the same time, the need for medical expert guidance is also a feature for contemporary reproduction and motherhood. Now, it seems like B should follow A, but since we haven't read all the statements, we can't really say that. What I should notice, however, is the phrase at the same time. When we say at the same time, normally it is used to introduce a contrast. So in A, we have focused on official discourses. In B, we are talking about the need for expert guidance. So we'll say that this probably suggests that some other features of mothering and motherhood should be mentioned earlier. But let's keep it at that. Now let's look at C. Similarly, historical work has shown what are now taken for granted aspects of reproduction and mothering practices result from contemporary pseudo-scientific directives and managed constructs. Now, when I read this sentence, I will probably say, I wonder what I just read. But the next sentence is very helpful. These changes have led to a reframing of modern discourses that pattern pregnancy and motherhood, leading to, and this is your clue, an acceptance of the need for greater expert management. So what you need to notice really is that B and C are both talking about expert guidance and the necessity for it. So I would say that since C starts off with similarly, and it also says that there is an acceptance of the need for greater expert management, I would probably club B and C together, because anyway this parajumble is so complicated that I'm clutching at straws. So we link B and C. Now let's look at D. This is where life is supposed to get a little easier. The contrasting, overlapping and ambiguous strands within these frameworks focus on a woman's biological tie to her child and predisposition to instinctively know and be able to care for her child. When it says the contrasting, overlapping and ambiguous strands within these frameworks, I need to have mentioned the frameworks earlier. So I would say that this is a follower for sure, and there is really not much else that I can derive from there. Now let's look at E. In addition, a third unofficial popular discourse. When I read this, it gives me some hope because I can immediately connect it to A. In A, we have talked about two official discourses. In E, we are talking about a third unofficial discourse. So automatically, I should be able to say that A and E are my first absolutely certain link. The B, C, I may not be so sure of, but this one is absolutely sure shot. So what do we have so far? We have connected A and E, and we also have connected B and C because they are the only ones that talk about expert guidance. All that we need to now figure out is how to connect anything else. Now, if you look at D, we are talking about the contrasting, overlapping and ambiguous strands within these frameworks. We have already mentioned 3 frameworks. In A, we have mentioned the official discourses, and in E, we have mentioned the third unofficial discourse. So, D can follow. So, whatever D is referring to has been mentioned in A and E, which means that A, E and D can be connected. After that, we have already said that B introduces the idea of medical guidance as a feature of motherhood. Now, this is actually a contrasting point. Why? Because if you look at D very carefully, D refers to how the official and even the unofficial discourse focus on a woman's tendency to instinctively be able to care for her child, instinctively. Whereas B talks about the need for expert guidance or outside help. So that is how we are able to connect D and B, because they are offering contrasting points, and when I say at the same time in B, it is a way to introduce a slightly different point of view. So now we finally have our entire sequence, which is A, E, D, B, C. In no way is this a simple parajumble. This is probably one of the toughest that we have done in this series. So in case you found it difficult, there is absolutely nothing to be worried about. It is difficult. Now let's take a look at this particular question. This is from CAT 2007, and in contrast to the question that we have just covered, this one is very, very simple. So as usual, the first sentence is fixed for you. A is a starter, so we don't need to worry about that. A says, I had 6,000 acres of land and had thus got much spare land besides the coffee plantation. Part of the farm was native forest and about 1,000 acres were squatters' land, what the Kikuyu called their shambas. So clearly this author is a slightly landlord type person, and the author is talking about the land and what the land ownership pattern was. B says the squatter's land was more intensely alive than the rest of the farm and was changing with the seasons the year round. So I know, of course, that B has to be placed after A, but immediately after A or a little bit later, I'm not very sure. So at this juncture, I'll just say, okay, maybe A and B can form a sequence, but I'm not very sure, which is why you'll see the gaps in the middle. C says the squatters are natives who, with their families, hold a few acres on a white man's farm. So what we have to understand here is that there is a basic logic that we use in most types of writing. In A, when we have talked about the squatters and we have talked about how much land they own, it is probably a little more logical for us to introduce who the squatters are, which C does. And after we have talked about what the squatters are and how they are related to the author, it makes sense to talk about what grows on the land. So I know for sure that A and C will form a better link than A and B. So in A, we have mentioned the squatters, also called the Kikuyu. C explains who the squatters are. And then in B, we are talking about how or what grows on the squatter's land. But after this, it's pretty simple. In B, we have said how the squatter's land was intensely alive as compared to the rest of the farm, and it was changing with the seasons the year round. So if you look at D, here also we are talking about what grew on the squatter's land. The key word in D, however, is also, which means that this is an add-on point. Before this, we will have to talk about what are the other things they grew. So I know that D probably will be mentioned somewhere after B, and of course the AC link is already there. Let's look at E. This is the only one that we need to place now. The beans ripened in the fields were gathered and thrashed by the women, and the maize stalks and coffee pods were collected and burned, so that in certain seasons, thin blue columns of smoke rose here and there all over the farm. Here, we are describing all the work that the squatters did on their farm. It also talks about seasonal variations. So clearly, these are the details that should follow B, because in B, we have said that the squatter's land was more intensely alive than the rest of the farm. How was it more intensely alive? It's mentioned in E. So now we have formed our BE link. Once this is done, the rest of the work is very, very simple. The answer, of course, is ACBED. All we need to do is to check this sequence once over and it will make perfect sense.